All right, man. Should we move on to the UN? The UN trying to push around the Fed.
Let's do it from one clown show to the next.
Yeah. All right, Chris, can you go slide number 7 there? So this is a article that hit the headlines. I believe it was on Monday. This is from the Wall Street Journal. UN calls for Fed, other central banks to halt interest rate increases. Chris actually sent this to me on Telegram in a DM. He's like, "Hey, I can't wait to talk about this on Wednesday." But if we go to the next slide, this is the actual report that these articles are talking about. Can we get slide number 8 up, please, Chris? So this is the Trade and Development Report, and this is a biannual report or whatever. It comes out after Q1 and after Q3. And this is where all of this stuff, UN is calling for policy change in the central banks. Now, right off the bat, I wanted to put this cover up here because what struck me is like it doesn't show happy people working internationally, at the UN, maybe some flags in the background, people shaking hands and smiling like everything's okay. No, what it shows is a cracked globe, a deglobalized world. What's happening to the world? I just think this is pretty amazing when you think about the visuals that they're portraying here. Is shit's going wrong. The world is cracking up. What do you think of that initial visual here, CK?
No, it absolutely is spot on. It just kind of shows you that there's definitely pain. It's also interesting. Like I don't know if that's like fire on the bottom left of the globe, or if that's like the sun. I don't know exactly what that is,
Yeah.
but it is extremely ominous imagery.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was crazy. Okay, let's go to the meat of this issue. So can you go to the next slide, please? All
I
right.
just want to
So,
say that
yeah,
it is funny when like there's like some like level of honesty, especially when it comes to like these reports or these visuals or whatever, and it does make you take a step back because you just assume like there's no honesty, that they're going to try to like paint some strange picture, and then you have to see like, wow, how bad is the situation if they're being forced to move away from maybe like a positive bias.
yeah, dude, you're reading my mind because that's what we're gonna do on a lot of this stuff. I actually agree with. It's just when they get to their policy stuff is the what I don't agree with, and I was very surprised with the honesty of this report until, of course, you get to the implementation, which is all socialist and communist stuff. But okay, let's get on with this. So, with financial entanglements since the global financial crisis becoming increasingly global, complex unanticipated shocks, including outbreaks and financial panic or extreme price volatility or a combination of external triggers, are a present danger. Monetary tightening poses additional risk to the real economy and the financial sector. Given the high leverage of non financial businesses, rising borrowing costs could cause a steep increase in non performing loans and trigger a cascade of bankruptcies. With direct price and markup controls ruled out as politically unacceptable, and if monetary authorities are unable to stabilize inflation quickly, governments might resort to additional fiscal tightening. This would only help precipitate a sharper global recession. And that's exactly what we are talking about there. That this monetary tightening is going to exacerbate the problem. It's not actually going to fix the problem, and they're calling it out right here in this UN report. All right, let's go to the next one here. Finally, what does seem likely? Oh, sorry, Chris, go back to the last one. I was just on the next paragraph. Finally, what does seem likely is that the impact of Fed tightening will be more severe for vulnerable emerging markets with high public and private debt, substantial foreign exchange exposure, a high dependence on food and fuel imports, and higher current account deficits. According to one recent estimate, an increase in the United States interest rates of 1% reduces real GDP by 0.5% in advanced economies and by 0.8% in emerging economies after 3 years. So I think this is interesting here because they are saying that emerging markets are much more exposed to a rising dollar, obviously, and it's going to hurt emerging markets more. And that's one thing that I have been saying. That's one thing we have been saying on FedWatch. Of course, there's been other strong dollar people out there in macro talking about this too. But now everyone's admitting it. Everyone knows, and they're starting to make sense. So, any feedback on that one, CK?
No feedback. We've been saying it for a long time on FedWatch. This is where the alpha is.
All right, let's go to next slide. So here is a wow moment to me. They mentioned the shadow banking sector. So the large role of the shadow banking sector, which is really just the Eurodollar system, remember that's offshore unregulated banks, means central banks have limited capacity to control credit expansion in large segments of the financial system. That is even more true for central banks in many developing economies, as they have more fragile financial systems, higher debt denominated in foreign currency, and greater exposure to commodity price shocks. In fact, many of them began to raise interest rates already in late 2021. All right, continuing on. Today, inflation is caused by a mixture of disruptions in global supply chains, high container shipping costs, the impact of war on key sectors, sanctions on key sectors, higher markups, commodity market speculators, and the ongoing uncertainty in an evolving pandemic. So, again, what don't they mention here? Money printing. They don't mention money printing. So all of this inflation that they're talking about here is not due to money printing. Of course, people will call me out and say, "Oh, are you saying that there is no money printing?" And I'm saying no. Most of the money printing happened before 2008, the great financial crisis, and since then we've just been at a very low level of credit creation, just enough to keep the lights on, and that's about it. And as we have these temporary shocks, we're never going to be getting out of it. We're always going to be sliding back into this low growth, low inflation situation.
This is kind of like the Fugoid cycle of deflation. So what's actually happening is from 2008, we've been kind of going into this deflationary cycle, and it's just been intensifying. And effectively what people are characterizing as like the insanity that is our current economy, and like the lack of being able to make any sort of logical assessment of what's going on, like they're just blanket labeling that inflation. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's some like money printing, maybe there is like reallocation of capital into different pools, but ultimately the entire system itself is kind of just like effectively floundering to death. If you see again, the Fugoid cycle is this idea of like when a plane is kind of diving and it's trying to like stop and like control itself and reclaim up, it actually gets more and more volatile as it's trying to like stabilize throughout that process. So it's a very good mental model for kind of like thinking through how these things play out.
Yeah, exactly. I still need to study up on that and listen to some Bitcoin Tina, I guess, because he's all over that.
Hey, Matthew Pines. So we had him on the
Pines,
show,
okay.
but he definitely was one of the first people to really kind of like talk about how we're kind of seeing that in the economy.
Cool. Yeah, I saw he started episode 1 of the Pines Pod. So he's got his own podcast going on now.
Everyone's got to start a podcast at some point in Bitcoin. That's how it works.
Yeah. All right, so let's continue with this. In this situation, central banks cannot bring inflation down at a socially acceptable cost. Instead, supply chain disruptions and labor shortages require appropriate industrial policies to increase the supply of key items in the medium term. This must be accompanied by sustained global policy coordination and liquidity support to help countries fund and manage these changes. And why I underline sustained, I underline sustained global policy coordination, because that's not possible. I mean, look at what's happening with the sanctions. Half the world is on one side of a major conflict, and half the world is on the other side of a major conflict. And now they're trying to say we need sustained global policy coordination. No way on earth is that going to happen. I mean, this goes into is you start seeing what they want. they start sounding like WEF, management economy, socialist and communist policies, et cetera, et cetera. But got anything for this, or should I move on to the next one?
Let's keep going.
All right, next one, please, there, Chris. All right, the scarring effects of these trends reflect what some observers have dubbed super hysteresis, whereby external shocks lead not only to a permanent loss of output due to recession, but also to a permanent reduction in the potential growth rate, because the decline in capital formation and in aggregate demand lowers labor productivity growth. In many developing countries, this threat has been amplified by a process of stalled industrialization and, in some cases, premature deindustrialization, rooted in the rapid liberalization of both the capital and current account under structural adjustment programs in the 80s and 90s, blah, 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 blah. But what this says, what I thought that was awesome, is this is the deflationary cycle. They're nailing it on the head here. This super hysteresis, where the shocks lead to permanent loss of growth and output. It kick the can, but the next one is lower growth, lower inflation, to kick the can, lower growth, lower inflation. And that's what they're detailing here. While interest rate hikes can fight temporary inflation pressures and help contain expectations, they also, as noted earlier, add to household business costs. In this sense, they will cause damage to the productive economy and increase exposure to future supply side shocks, perpetuating the line of policy action that privileges financial markets over non-financial businesses. And again, this is exactly what we were talking about. So the world is facing a systemic crisis, and only systemic action can solve it. So now they get into their guiding principles for what they want the policy to get to. So let's go to the next slide.
I mean, before we do,
go ahead.
Can I just jump in and like, this is something that is actually, I feel like, is very common, that we kind of see like good analysis, and then the assumption is the market doesn't work, we need coordinated top-down decision making to fix it. That is always the assumption. A lot of you see similar assumptions from environmental groups regarding, maybe, how we're treating the planet. That I don't want to stick to one narrative, but it becomes very obvious to see that these organizations operate within a similar framework, and their bias is that the market doesn't work. And that's a problem, frankly. Like, that is one of the key problems.
Exactly. It's always more intervention. Intervention begets intervention. And eventually you have every single sector, every single facet of the economy under the thumb of the central planner. And guess what they need for that? I think they need a CBDC.
They need a CBDC, but I also think that when that does happen, or if it does happen and it inevitably leads to worse outcome, they're still going to blame the market. Like, they're still going to blame the market. It's their fault. They're still going to blame the market.
Yep, it's always a market failure. Everything is blamed on a market failure.
Maybe the market's the only thing that doesn't fail.
Exactly. There's no such thing as a market failure. But let's get on to these policy programs that they say that all these policy programs should have the following elements. They need to contain inflation. So policymakers should avoid an undue reliance on monetary tightening and forswear a premature return to austerity budget. So don't go into austerity. You spend. Managing growth is the second one. Monetary and fiscal rules need to be better adapted, not just to respond to shocks, but also to support the much needed structural changes in the economy, such as industrialization in developing countries and the energy transition. Investment first. There needs to be higher public investment in economic and social infrastructure to boost employment, raise productivity, improve energy efficiency, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an internationally coordinated effort. So, of course, an internationally coordinated effort is never going to work. Also, if you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you're not going to be raising productivity. So all of these things are counterproductive or counterfactual. They'll never work together. But if you go to the next slide here, these are their last two recommendations. So I wanted to read through these a little bit more in depth. So leveling up. While antitrust measures and income policies to boost productivity can help achieve more equitable distribution of income, redistributive policies can help mitigate unbalanced outcomes. These include the reinforcement of public service provisions and progressive tax reform, such as wealth and windfall taxes, together with a reduction of regressive tax cuts and loopholes. So again, this is straight out of pretty much the Communist Manifesto. This is what we want to do. We want to redistribute income. We want to cut down all of your tax loopholes, and we want to have just raise taxes and redistribute all that wealth. So let's go on to the next one. A new Bretton Woods. In an interdependent world, calling for greater ambition from domestic policymakers requires rethinking global economic governance from a development perspective. Again, rethinking things, redoing things. This is all a WEF calling card. It's a global Marxist calling card. Almost 8 decades from the foundational conference in New Hampshire, the international financial architecture is struggling to address the imbalances and inequities of a hyper-globalized world order. So what I would respond to that is, guess what? We're de-globalizing. That's what we're doing. So you can't respond to a hyper-globalized order. Well, that's okay, because we're de-globalizing and we're going to get new money, right? We're going to get Bitcoin is going to service this new de-globalized order. So that's all I have from the UN here. CK, any further comments?
I mean, I think that they're right that we are de-globalizing, that hyper-globalization, and I think credit fueled fiat money, probably all of that has created a lot of inequality. Again, I would say that is a centralized top-down decision-making issue, not necessarily a market issue. But Bitcoin is the new Bretton Woods. And I want to go to kind of your talk track through what was wrong with what's his face, Zoltan's analysis a few weeks ago, because I think that you framed it perfectly on that podcast, which is that the framework of everyone working together, this kind of framework that let the Paris Climate Treaty work, this UN world, like of everyone getting together and working, to have some goal, like that framework is not reality in any way. And like, we're actually moving into a different sort of framework. So maybe I'll hand it over to you, Ansel. Like, can you repeat how you kind of architect, or how you articulate what is going on globally, and why this type of like nation state level coordination as like the basis of your analysis just makes absolutely no sense?
Yeah, well, just to reiterate what that was a couple weeks ago, Zoltan had 3 pillars. It was like cheap labor in China, cheap Mexican labor in the United States, cheap products from China, and something else cheap. Maybe it was cheap international commodities or something like that. But what I said was he wasn't going deep enough, and he needed to talk about what enabled those things in the first place, and that was a peaceful free trade era. And he said that in the sentence above that. He said, in this global era of peace, these are the 3 pillars. Well, no, he just skipped over the whole important part, talking about peace. And what have we seen since deglobalization started really taking hold? We see, of course, the Ukraine-Russia thing. We see Pakistan. We see some border conflicts between Tajikistan and I think it was Turkmenistan. We see stuff happening in Sri Lanka. We see stuff happening in Iran, all around the rimland of the world island that is Eurasia. We see conflict, even the rhetoric going on in China with Taiwan. Now, all of that is not peaceful rhetoric, and it's not good for business. So what's going to happen? Credit is going to be affected. Credit and global credit is going to decline. It's going to contract. So in the previous era where we had peace and good business climate and everybody could get a loan, and all of these countries, emerging markets, even the Western advanced economies could get access to cheap credit and could build up. Then we needed the market naturally chose a credit-based money for that because it was highly elastic and it could expand. But now, as we're going the other direction, what's needed is a money that is resistant to credit collapse. And a credit-based money is not that. You need to have a commodity-based money. Most likely Bitcoin is going to be chosen for this. So we don't need central planning. We just need to let the market go, and the market will naturally tend towards a credit, a money that is resistant to credit collapse. Does that make sense, CK?
No, it makes complete sense, and I think that if you look at the incentives, Bitcoin's game theory makes a lot of sense right now. The way that the world is situated, Bitcoin's game theory makes a lot of sense. And I think the next topic, which we need to get to because we're running out of time, also is another point in why Bitcoin's game theory makes sense. But let's talk about OPEC.